In Part 1, we explored the first 10 chapters of Prometheus Rising, decoding the circuits of survival, status, language, social conditioning, bodily bliss, metaprogramming, and evolutionary memory. We saw how each layer of consciousness builds upon the last, shaping everything we think, feel, believe, and experience, often without realizing we're trapped inside programs not of our own making. But Robert Anton Wilson's map doesn't stop there. In this second part, we go deeper, into the final 8 chapters of the book, where the boundaries of identity, space, time, and even reality itself begin to dissolve. This is where Wilson's work truly becomes radical, as we begin to unlock circuits of transpersonal awareness, quantum consciousness, and dimensions that lie beyond ordinary experience. If you've come this far, you're ready. Let's continue with Chapter 11. In Chapter 11 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson invites readers into what may be the most radical shift yet in his 8-circuit model, the psychoatomic circuit, also known as Timothy Leary's quantum consciousness circuit. If the earlier circuits map the domains of survival, status, symbolic abstraction, bodily bliss, metaprogramming, and evolutionary awareness, this circuit ventures into entirely new terrain, the structure of reality itself and the role of consciousness in shaping it. This chapter reflects Wilson's fascination with quantum physics, Eastern mysticism, and radical psychology. It's here that Wilson makes some of his boldest assertions, that the human nervous system, when properly activated, can enter into states of consciousness where the very nature of space, time, matter, and identity dissolve, revealing a reality far more fluid, interconnected, and indeterminate than anything our cultural conditioning allows us to imagine. Wilson begins by noting that most people live in a reality constructed by the lower circuits, survival fears, dominant struggles, symbolic maps, social roles, bodily sensations, and culturally conditioned beliefs. Even those who master metaprogramming and evolutionary consciousness may still take for granted a Newtonian Cartesian view of the world, a world made of discrete objects moving through linear time and existing in rigid cause and effect chains. But the discoveries of 20th century physics, relativity, quantum mechanics, uncertainty, non-locality, reveal a very different picture. Wilson argues that the universe revealed by modern physics is fundamentally discontinuous, probabilistic, paradoxical, and interconnected in ways that defy common sense. The psychoatomic circuit is the neurological gateway to directly experiencing this quantum reality. Here, consciousness begins to operate not from the conditioned ego, or even from the metaprogrammer's flexible worldview, but from a fluid, dynamic awareness that perceives reality itself as a dance of probabilities, uncertainties, and interconnected fields of energy. In this state, Wilson suggests, the nervous system stops organizing experience into rigid categories of self and other, subject and object, before and after. Instead, it perceives a flowing, indeterminate field of possibilities, where everything influences everything else, where the observer is part of what is observed, and where identity itself becomes a shimmering flux rather than a fixed structure. Wilson connects this directly to the insights of quantum physics, the observer effect, wave-particle duality, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. All of these principles suggest that the act of observation shapes reality at the most fundamental level, and that certainty itself is an illusion born of coarse-grained, lower-circuit perception. But Wilson's claim goes further. He suggests that the nervous system is capable of experiencing this uncertainty directly, not just as a scientific theory, but as an altered state of consciousness. This state has been described by mystics and meditators throughout history. The experience of emptiness in Buddhism, the realization of Maya in Hinduism, the Taoist vision of the world as a dance of polarities. For Wilson, these mystical states reflect direct neurological activation of the psychoatomic circuit, states in which the nervous system perceives reality as a quantum flux of possibilities, where identity is fluid, and where time itself becomes relative. One of the key features of this circuit is the collapse of the ordinary sense of time. In this state, past, present, and future may no longer appear as a linear sequence, but as an interwoven network of possibilities, echoes, and anticipations. the mind begins to operate in what Wilson calls non-local consciousness, an awareness that transcends the usual boundaries of space and time. This is why Wilson sees the psychoatomic circuit as potentially revolutionary. It allows the individual to break free not only from cultural conditioning, but from the very assumptions embedded in Newtonian Cartesian reality tunnels. In this state, the individual no longer perceives themselves as a thing in a universe of other things, but as a process in an interdependent web of processes, a node in an infinite network of relationships, influences, and feedback loops. Wilson also links this circuit to psychedelic experience, particularly with substances like LSD and psilocybin, which have been reported to induce states of consciousness where ordinary perception dissolves into fields of vibrating energy, where objects and identities lose their solidity, and where everything appears as interconnected patterns. He emphasizes that these experiences are not hallucinations in the pejorative sense, but glimpses into a deeper level of reality, a level that quantum physics is only beginning to describe in mathematical terms, but that consciousness can directly encounter when freed from lower circuit conditioning. One of Wilson's favorite examples is the idea that particles do not have definite properties until measured, a principle central to quantum mechanics. In ordinary consciousness, we assume that objects out there have independent existence and characteristics regardless of our observation. But the psychoatomic circuit reveals that what we take for granted as objective reality is itself shaped, conditioned, and collapsed by observation. In other words, the observer and the observed are entangled. Reality is not simply out there, but emerges in the act of perception itself. This realization can be profoundly liberating, but also deeply destabilizing. To activate this circuit is to recognize that certainty itself is a lower circuit habit, that categories, boundaries, and fixed identities are provisional conveniences, and that the universe itself is playful, paradoxical, and probabilistic. Wilson acknowledges that this state of consciousness is not easily integrated into ordinary life. The fluidity of the psychoatomic circuit can induce awe, ecstasy, and creativity, but it can also produce confusion, disorientation, and even a sense of existential vertigo. This is why Wilson insists on the importance of grounding higher circuit experiences in the practical wisdom of the earlier circuits. One must not abandon survival needs, social roles, or metaprogramming flexibility simply because one has glimpsed the quantum dance of reality. Instead, the psychoatomic circuit offers an opportunity for what Wilson calls quantum psychology, a playful, flexible, probabilistic way of being that allows us to navigate uncertainty, ambiguity, and paradox without falling into rigidity or despair. Wilson proposes that this mode of consciousness is essential for the challenges of the modern world. In a universe increasingly understood as complex, dynamic, and unpredictable, the ability to think and feel probabilistically, to live without clinging to rigid certainties, becomes an evolutionary advantage. He offers several exercises for activating this circuit. One involves deliberately cultivating uncertainty, questioning every assumption, adopting multiple perspectives simultaneously, and practicing what Zen calls beginner's mind, an attitude of openness, curiosity, and non-attachment to fixed views. Another exercise suggests practicing awareness of quantum processes in everyday life, recognizing that every choice, perception, and interpretation is collapsing a field of possibilities into a particular experience, and that alternative choices might yield entirely different realities. A more advanced exercise involves meditative contemplation of impermanence, change, and flux, deliberately loosening attachment to fixed identities, narratives, and categories, and opening to the flow of experience as it arises moment by moment. By the end of Chapter 11, Wilson presents the psychoatomic circuit as both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge because it destabilizes everything we think we know, and an opportunity because it frees us to navigate reality with creativity, humility, and openness. This circuit completes Wilson's progression into what he calls the higher circuits, levels of consciousness that transcend the biological, social, and even psychological dimensions of ordinary human experience and open into evolutionary potentials that few cultures have explored systematically. At this point, the reader begins to grasp the enormity of Wilson's project. Prometheus Rising is not merely a psychology book, it is a map for the evolution of human consciousness itself. A guide to becoming not just a flexible individual, but a participant in the ongoing creation of reality. The psychoatomic circuit is a gateway into that adventure. The first step into a mode of being where reality itself becomes malleable, where certainty dissolves into possibility, and where consciousness is recognized not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in the unfolding of the cosmos. In Chapter 12 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson leads us into what he considers the most transcendent level of human consciousness, the neuroatomic circuit, sometimes described as the eighth and final circuit in Timothy Leary's model. This circuit is where everything that has come before, the survival instincts of the first circuit, the status games of the second, the symbols of the third, the socio-sexual conditioning of the fourth, the body ecstasies of the fifth, the reprogramming abilities of the sixth, and the evolutionary awareness of the seventh, culminates in a radically expanded state of being. Here, Wilson discusses a mode of consciousness that transcends even the relativistic, probabilistic worldview of the sixth and seventh circuits. This eighth circuit, he says, represents the opening of human awareness to dimensions far beyond the personal, cultural, or even planetary, to what can only be described as cosmic consciousness. Wilson emphasizes that this is not metaphorical language. The neuroatomic circuit involves a literal shift in the operational mode of the nervous system. The individual begins to experience themselves as part of a cosmic network of energy, intelligence, and evolution that extends beyond all boundaries of time, space, and identity. At this level, the nervous system becomes fully non-local, not just metaphorically but experientially. In this mode, distinctions between observer and observed, subject and object, self and other, dissolve completely. The entire cosmos becomes a field of consciousness in which the individual participates directly, as both an expression of and contributor to its unfolding. This is why Wilson links the neuroatomic circuit to the classic mystical experiences described by sages, saints, and shamans throughout human history, states of samadhi, satori, enlightenment, cosmic unity. But Wilson's genius is in connecting these ancient mystical traditions with modern science. He suggests that what mystics have described in poetic language for thousands of years, the experience of oneness with the universe, can now be understood in terms of neurobiology and quantum physics. The nervous system itself, when fully activated, becomes the instrument of cosmic perception. Where the earlier circuits operated within evolutionary, cultural, and linguistic frameworks, this eighth circuit is transhuman. It reveals a mode of existence in which the boundaries of individuality dissolve entirely, and consciousness recognizes itself as a cosmic process, evolving, adapting, playing, exploring itself through countless forms. In this state, the individual's relationship to time undergoes a profound transformation. The linear, clock-based time of the lower circuits gives way to an experience of timelessness, or more precisely, an experience of time as an infinite present in which all possibilities coexist. Wilson emphasizes that this circuit brings not just expanded perception, but profound peace. All fears, all anxieties, all attachments that characterize lower circuit consciousness fall away, because they depend on the illusion of separateness, individuality, and linear causality. In eighth circuit consciousness, there is no longer any me struggling against a hostile universe, no longer any rigid distinction between self and environment, no longer any fear of death, failure, or loss. The entire play of existence is seen as a single integrated dance of energy and intelligence, endlessly creating and dissolving itself. Wilson notes that experiences of this kind are rare, fleeting, and difficult to integrate into ordinary life, but that they are real nonetheless, and they represent the evolutionary potential of the human nervous system. He connects this to reports from astronauts who, upon seeing the Earth from space, describe a sudden, spontaneous shift into a sense of global unity, ecological awareness, and cosmic perspective, what has come to be called the overview effect. This experience, Wilson suggests, is a taste of eighth circuit consciousness, an immediate recognition that all boundaries are illusory, that all conflicts are local misunderstandings, and that the entire planet is a single fragile organism embedded in a larger cosmic ecology. Wilson is careful to emphasize that this is not a belief, but a mode of perception. Eighth Circuit consciousness does not depend on doctrines, ideologies, or dogmas. It is a direct neurological experience that transcends all belief systems. In this sense, the neuroatomic circuit is both deeply mystical and deeply empirical. It does not ask us to believe in cosmic unity, but to experience it directly through the activation of our own nervous system. Wilson also acknowledges that this circuit has been glimpsed, though often misunderstood, throughout history. He points to the psychedelic experiments of the 1960s, the ecstatic visions of mystics, the philosophical speculations of thinkers like Giordano Bruno, Spinoza, and Teilhard de Chardin, and the cosmological insights of modern physics as all pointing toward this same reality. That consciousness itself is not confined to the individual brain, but is a fundamental feature of the universe itself. In this state, identity becomes fluid, cosmic, and transpersonal. The individual no longer experiences themselves as a separate self at all, but as a process of consciousness participating in an infinite field of processes. This dissolution of individuality is not experienced as loss, but as liberation, a release from all the limitations, fears, anxieties, and tensions that arise from lower circuit conditioning. But Wilson also cautions that this state can be dangerous or destabilizing if not properly grounded. Without careful preparation and integration, glimpses of Eighth Circuit consciousness can produce dissociation, mania, or disconnection from practical realities. The challenge, as always in Wilson's model, is not merely to transcend, but to integrate, to balance the profound expansiveness of Eighth Circuit consciousness with embodied relational and cultural realities of everyday life. Wilson suggests that Eighth Circuit awareness is not meant to replace ordinary consciousness, but to enrich it, to provide a cosmic context for our local dramas, struggles, and joys. When properly integrated, Eighth Circuit consciousness allows the individual to navigate life with a profound sense of perspective, compassion, and creative freedom. The petty concerns of ego and status lose their grip, replaced by a serene awareness of our place in the vast, ongoing dance of existence. In this state, one does not cling to rigid beliefs, identities, or narratives, but lives fluidly, playfully, creatively, recognizing that all forms, all distinctions, all stories are temporary structures in an ever-changing cosmos. Wilson offers several exercises to help readers cultivate this awareness. One involves meditative contemplation of the cosmos itself, imagining the vast scale of space and time, the billions of galaxies, the endless cycles of birth and death, creation and destruction, and recognizing oneself as part of this process. Another exercise suggests cultivating a cosmic perspective on personal problems, deliberately reframing everyday challenges, frustrations, or anxieties within the vast context of cosmic evolution, seeing them as brief, local fluctuations in an infinite field of possibility. A more advanced practice involves embracing uncertainty and impermanence as essential features of reality, learning to live gracefully with flux, change, and dissolution. This practice prepares the nervous system to tolerate, and even enjoy, the fluidity and openness of Eighth Circuit consciousness. By the end of Chapter 12, Wilson makes it clear that the neuroatomic circuit represents the highest potential of the human nervous system as we currently understand it. It is the culmination of an evolutionary journey from simple reflexes and instincts to language, culture, metaprogramming, evolutionary awareness, and ultimately, cosmic participation. Wilson's challenge to the reader is simple but profound. Are you willing to awaken this potential? Are you ready to let go of the comforting illusions of separateness, certainty, and permanence, and embrace the fluid, interconnected, and ever-changing dance of the cosmos? This chapter, like the circuit it describes, dissolves all boundaries between science and mysticism, self and other, mind and universe, form and emptiness. It invites us to recognize that we are not isolated egos struggling for survival on a hostile planet, but manifestations of a single cosmic process, endlessly evolving, exploring, and awakening itself. In this sense, The neuroatomic circuit is the culmination of Wilson's entire project in Prometheus Rising, an invitation to step beyond all programs, all maps, all tunnels of reality, and participate consciously in the evolution of consciousness itself. In Chapter 13 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson pivots slightly from the upward march through circuits and instead delivers a deeply important operational insight, the feedback principle. This chapter functions as a kind of meta-commentary on everything that has come before, a reflection on how consciousness, perception, behavior, and reality itself are shaped by feedback loops, both internal and external. Wilson invites us to examine our own minds not as fixed entities, but as dynamic systems engaged in constant interaction with their environments. At its core, the feedback principle is a simple yet profound idea. Any system that contains a feedback mechanism becomes capable of self-regulation, self-correction, and adaptation. This applies as much to machines as it does to biological organisms and to the mind itself. A thermostat is a classic example of a simple feedback loop. It measures room temperature, compares it to a preset threshold, and activates heating or cooling systems to maintain equilibrium. But human consciousness, Wilson argues, is an incredibly complex set of interlocking feedback loops, far more subtle and intricate than any machine. This chapter emphasizes that the nervous system does not merely receive information passively, it actively shapes, filters, and organizes that information according to its existing programs, and then feeds the results back into itself to modify its own structure and behavior. In other words, every perception is filtered by prior learning, every action elicits a response from the environment, and every response from the environment becomes new information that feeds back into the mind, altering future perceptions and actions. This creates an ongoing cycle of learning and adaptation, but it also creates the conditions for self-reinforcing illusions and self-perpetuating belief systems. Wilson connects this directly to his earlier observation that what the thinker thinks, the proverb proves. Once a belief, program, or worldview is installed in the nervous system, the feedback loops of perception and behavior tend to confirm it. If you believe that people are fundamentally hostile, you will tend to perceive hostility even where it doesn't exist, behave defensively, and elicit genuinely hostile responses, confirming your original belief and feeding it back into your nervous system as proof. The same mechanism applies to more subtle and complex worldviews. If you believe that you are unlucky, inferior, superior, doomed, blessed, or entitled, your perceptions and behaviors will tend to elicit results that confirm those beliefs, feeding them back into your mind as evidence and reinforcing them over time. Wilson's insight here is both liberating and sobering. The nervous system is a self-programming feedback system, but most people allow their early conditioning to determine the structure of their feedback loops indefinitely. They live inside closed systems of thought, behavior, and perception that continually reinforce themselves. The feedback principle then becomes a key tool for conscious evolution. If we recognize how feedback loops work, we can begin to intervene deliberately, breaking vicious cycles of negative feedback, creating virtuous cycles of positive feedback, and designing feedback systems that expand awareness rather than contract it. Wilson encourages us to look at all levels of experience through the lens of feedback. At the biological level, homeostasis is maintained through feedback mechanisms that regulate temperature, hunger, thirst, arousal, and rest. At the emotional level, moods and feelings interact with behavior and social responses to create self-reinforcing patterns. At the cognitive level, beliefs generate perceptions and behaviors that confirm and entrench those beliefs. Even at the social level, entire cultures operate as vast feedback systems. Ideas, customs, laws, symbols, rituals, all interact with individual nervous systems, shaping behavior and reinforcing cultural norms, which in turn shape future generations. Wilson suggests that the key to mastering this principle lies in cultivating meta-awareness, the ability to observe one's own feedback loops as they operate in real time, recognize their effects, and intervene creatively when necessary. This is where the feedback principle dovetails with the sixth circuit of metaprogramming. The metaprogrammer is precisely the individual who has become aware of their own feedback loops and who takes responsibility for adjusting them to serve evolving goals, desires, and values. But Wilson's analysis goes even further. He suggests that the feedback principle applies not just within the individual mind, but between minds, in relationships, families, communities, and entire civilizations. When two people interact, each becomes part of the other's feedback loop. The way you speak, act, and behave shapes the other's perceptions and responses, which in turn shape your own subsequent behavior. This dynamic creates complex patterns of interaction that can stabilize into predictable relationships or spiral into conflict, misunderstanding, or growth. Wilson invites readers to consider how their own interactions function as feedback loops. Do they elicit trust, curiosity, creativity, and openness from others, or do they elicit defensiveness, suspicion, rigidity, and withdrawal? By becoming aware of these loops, we can begin to design interactions consciously, creating feedback systems that foster mutual growth, understanding, and evolution. At the societal level, Wilson applies the feedback principle to institutions, ideologies, and cultures. He points out that most large-scale human systems, governments, religions, corporations, educational systems, tend to evolve feedback mechanisms that preserve their own structures and resist change. This leads to what systems theorists call homeostatic resistance, the tendency of a system to maintain its existing state and resist perturbations, even when those perturbations might offer opportunities for adaptation or improvement. In this sense, Wilson argues, the feedback principle helps explain why revolutions so often fail. They attempt to impose top-down changes on systems whose feedback mechanisms are designed to preserve existing power structures, belief systems, and cultural norms. True revolution, Wilson suggests, would require redesigning the feedback loops themselves, creating structures that reward adaptability, creativity, feedback, and learning, rather than rigid adherence to tradition or ideology. He connects this insight to the challenge of personal growth as well. If we wish to change ourselves, we must not simply try to adopt new beliefs or behaviors, but consciously redesign the feedback loops that maintain our existing programs. This requires a kind of systems thinking, an ability to see one's own mind, body, relationships, and environment as interlocking networks of feedback, and to begin adjusting those networks creatively. Wilson emphasizes that this is not a simple task. Feedback loops are powerful precisely because they are self-reinforcing. The longer they have been operating, the more entrenched they become, and the more difficult they are to change. But they can be changed, and the feedback principle itself offers the key. Every small change we make in perception, behavior, or belief alters the feedback we receive from our environment and ourselves, which in turn modifies the conditions for future change. In this way, change can begin anywhere in the loop and propagate through the system. Wilson suggests several practical exercises to cultivate awareness of feedback loops. One involves keeping a journal of daily interactions, noting how your perceptions, beliefs, emotions, and behaviors influence others' responses and how those responses influence your own subsequent reactions. Another exercise involves deliberately experimenting with small changes in behavior, adopting a different tone of voice, posture, facial expression, or conversational style, and observing how this alters the feedback you receive from others. A more advanced practice involves exploring feedback loops within oneself, noticing how moods and thoughts interact to reinforce or disrupt each other, how physical posture influences emotional states, and how beliefs shape perceptions, which in turn shape beliefs. By the end of chapter 13, Wilson makes it clear that the feedback principle is not just a concept, but a tool for conscious evolution. The individual who understands and applies this principle becomes capable of redesigning their own nervous system, relationships, and interactions with the world in creative, adaptive, and liberating ways. They cease being a passive victim of inherited programs and become an active participant in their own self-creation. In this sense, Chapter 13 provides a unifying insight that ties together all the circuits discussed so far. Each circuit operates through feedback loops. Survival signals feed back into the biosurvival circuit. Dominance interactions feed back into the emotional territorial circuit. Language shapes thought, which shapes language. Cultural norms shape behavior, which reinforces cultural norms. bodily awareness and pleasure feed back into relaxation or tension. Metaprogramming feeds back into belief revision. Evolutionary awareness feeds back into identity expansion. And cosmic consciousness feeds back into the perception of unity. The feedback principle is the common thread running through all of these processes. It reveals the structure of consciousness itself as a dynamic, evolving, self-organizing system. A system that can, with sufficient awareness, become self-liberating. In Chapter 14 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson deepens the inquiry into perception itself, building on the feedback principle discussed in the previous chapter. This time, Wilson challenges not just what we perceive, but how perception operates at its most fundamental level, a radical reassessment that blends psychology, quantum physics, and mysticism into what he calls quantum models of perception. The chapter begins by confronting a core assumption of everyday life, that perception is straightforward and objective, that we see what's out there. But Wilson reminds us that this is not how either neuroscience or quantum mechanics describe reality. In truth, what we experience as reality is the result of an interaction between the nervous system and the environment, a transaction shaped by feedback, interpretation, expectation, belief, and neurological structure. In this sense, perception is not a window onto the world, but a creative act of construction, a dynamic process in which sensory input is filtered, organized, and synthesized into a coherent model that we then take to be the world. Wilson traces this back to the classic statement of cognitive psychology. We don't perceive the world as it is. We perceive the world as we are. This means that every perception is already colored by biological predispositions, first circuit, emotional reactions, second circuit, cultural programming, fourth circuit, linguistic frameworks, third circuit, and the self-modifying feedback loops that accumulate over a lifetime. But Wilson takes this insight further. Drawing on quantum mechanics, he suggests that reality itself, at least at the subatomic level, behaves nothing like our classical intuitions suggest. Quantum particles do not have definite locations, momenta, or properties until measured. They exist as clouds of probabilities, interacting with observers in ways that seem to collapse these probabilities into definite outcomes. This leads Wilson to propose that perception itself functions like a quantum measurement. Just as physicists cannot speak meaningfully of the properties of a particle apart from the act of measurement, so too does the human nervous system collapse potential sensory data into the specific perceptions that constitute a reality tunnel. In this view, our nervous system acts as a quantum filter, constantly transforming an ambiguous, probabilistic field of possibilities into the stable, consistent reality we navigate day to day. Wilson emphasizes that this does not mean everything is an illusion or that reality itself is purely subjective. Rather, it means that what we call reality is a co-creation, a transaction between the perceiver and the perceived, where both are shaped by feedback loops, cultural programs, evolutionary history, and neurological structures. This is a staggering insight with profound implications. It suggests that different individuals, cultures, and species inhabit different perceptual realities, not just metaphorically but literally, at the level of neurological construction. A dog's sensory world differs from a human's because its nervous system privileges smell over sight. A bee perceives ultraviolet patterns invisible to us. A bat navigates by echolocation. Each nervous system constructs its own version of the world, and no single construction can claim to be an objective representation of reality itself. Wilson uses this to illustrate the futility of absolute certainty. If perception is fundamentally a construction, a neurological interpretation filtered through probabilistic frameworks, then all worldviews, ideologies, and dogmas must be provisional, adaptable, and open to revision. This insight feeds directly back into the feedback principle. Belief systems shape perception, and perception shapes belief systems, creating self-reinforcing reality tunnels that feel real, precisely because they generate consistent feedback. Wilson points out that the more rigid a belief system becomes, the more narrowly it constrains perception itself. Individuals locked into rigid ideological frameworks will literally perceive the world in ways that confirm their beliefs, not because their beliefs are true in any absolute sense, but because perception is shaped by expectation, attention, and filtering mechanisms. This is what Wilson calls semantic indeterminacy, the idea that symbols, meanings, and perceptions are not fixed but fluid, shifting according to context, expectation, and the state of the observer's nervous system. Wilson's quantum model of perception is not just an abstract philosophical speculation, it is intended as a practical tool for expanding awareness. By recognizing that perception is a construction, we can begin to loosen the grip of rigid interpretations, habitual reactions, and culturally imposed categories. We can cultivate multi-model thinking, the ability to entertain multiple interpretations simultaneously, to shift between perspectives fluidly, and to treat all models as useful maps rather than literal truths. Wilson illustrates this with examples from daily life. A person locked into a pessimistic reality tunnel will filter events to confirm their pessimism, noticing failures, setbacks, and obstacles while ignoring opportunities, support, and success. Conversely, an optimistic reality tunnel will filter perception differently, highlighting opportunities and diminishing obstacles. Both tunnels generate consistent feedback loops, but neither is an objective description of reality. Each is a quantum collapse shaped by expectation. At the societal level, this principle helps explain why different cultures, subcultures, and ideological groups often seem to live in different worlds. They do. Their perceptual apparatuses, belief systems, and feedback loops construct radically different versions of reality, each internally consistent and resistant to change. Wilson warns that this principle can be both liberating and dangerous. On the one hand, it allows us to adopt playful, flexible, adaptive modes of consciousness, to explore multiple realities without rigid attachment. On the other hand, it explains how entire populations can become trapped in shared delusions, paranoid ideologies, and dogmatic belief systems that generate self-confirming feedback and resist correction. This is why Wilson advocates for conscious metaprogramming as an antidote to perceptual rigidity. By becoming aware of how our nervous systems construct reality, we can begin to take responsibility for our perceptions, beliefs, and behaviors. This is not an invitation to nihilism or relativistic cynicism, but an opportunity for creative exploration, to design reality tunnels that foster curiosity, compassion, adaptability, and growth. Wilson also suggests that the quantum model of perception points toward a more participatory understanding of reality itself. We are not passive observers of a fixed universe. We are active participants in an evolving, probabilistic cosmos where perception, interpretation, and belief play a role in shaping what appears. In this sense, Chapter 14 brings Wilson's project full circle. The individual who understands this principle begins to see themselves not as a victim of circumstance or a passive consumer of sensory data, but as a creative participant in the construction of their own experience, and, by extension, in the collective evolution of human consciousness. The exercises Wilson proposes in this chapter are designed to help cultivate this flexibility and creativity. One exercise involves consciously shifting perspectives on a single event or situation, imagining it from the viewpoint of different cultures, philosophies, or belief systems to see how interpretations change. Another exercise suggests deliberately adopting multiple emotional responses to the same event, exploring how anger, compassion, humor, or detachment alter the perception of the event itself. A more advanced practice involves questioning the very structure of perception, noticing how attention selects, filters, and organizes sensory data, and experimenting with shifting attention to reveal new dimensions of experience. By the end of Chapter 14, Wilson leaves us with a challenge. If perception is fundamentally creative, what kind of world do you want to create? What kind of reality tunnel will you choose to construct, inhabit, and share with others? This is not a trivial question, but a profound invitation to take responsibility for the most intimate and powerful faculty we possess, the act of perceiving itself. In this sense, the quantum model of perception is not just a theory, but a practice, a path toward greater freedom, flexibility, and playfulness in the dance of existence. In Chapter 15 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson circles back to one of the book's most powerful and central ideas, the relationship between what he calls the thinker and the prover. While earlier chapters have guided us through the successive layers and circuits of consciousness, this chapter pauses to examine a mechanism that operates within all circuits and shapes the very construction of our reality tunnels. At its core, this principle is deceptively simple. What the thinker thinks, the prover proves. This statement, repeated like a mantra throughout Wilson's work, describes the feedback loop between belief and experience. The thinker is that part of consciousness that generates ideas, beliefs, opinions, assumptions, and worldviews, the narrative-generating faculty that organizes and interprets experience. The prover, by contrast, is that deeper, largely unconscious function that seeks out evidence to confirm whatever the thinker has decided to believe. Wilson emphasizes that this relationship is not metaphorical, but operational. It defines how human nervous systems function at a fundamental level. Once the thinker settles on a belief about oneself, others, the world, or reality itself, the prover goes to work finding, filtering, and emphasizing sensory input, memories, and interpretations that support that belief. This feedback loop creates what Wilson calls reality tunnels, internally consistent but often radically different models of reality that feel absolutely true to those who inhabit them. If the thinker thinks the world is hostile and dangerous, the prover ensures that experience confirms this belief. Hostile interpretations will dominate perception, memories of past danger will rise to the surface, and ambiguous situations will be interpreted as threatening. Likewise, if the thinker decides the world is friendly and abundant, the prover will organize perception around this premise, emphasizing opportunities, synchronicities, and cooperative behaviors while minimizing threats or setbacks. The same mechanism applies to beliefs about selfhood, relationships, politics, philosophy, and even science. Whatever narrative the thinker adopts, whether pessimistic or optimistic, paranoid or trusting, cynical or hopeful, the prover diligently ensures that reality seems to conform to this narrative. Wilson points out that this mechanism explains both the tremendous diversity of human belief systems and the tenacity with which individuals cling to them. When your nervous system is organized around a particular belief, it does not merely hold that belief, it perceives the world through that belief. This is why debates between people in different reality tunnels often feel futile and frustrating. Each person's prover has assembled a mountain of evidence confirming their own worldview, while ignoring, dismissing, or reinterpreting evidence that does not fit. Wilson takes this insight further by emphasizing that the thinker-prover relationship is a biological fact, a feature of our nervous systems, not a philosophical choice. This means that everyone, without exception, lives inside a reality tunnel shaped by the interaction between their thinking mind and their proving nervous system. But here lies both the danger and the opportunity. Most people remain unconscious of this mechanism, allowing their early imprinting, conditioning, and cultural programming to shape their beliefs, which the prover then confirms endlessly, reinforcing old patterns. Wilson's challenge is to recognize this mechanism consciously and begin using it deliberately. By choosing new thoughts, narratives, and beliefs, even provisionally, we can prompt the prover to generate new evidence, reshaping our reality tunnels and expanding our possibilities. This is not magical thinking or wishful optimism. It is a practical application of the feedback principle combined with the metaprogramming circuit. By experimenting with beliefs, we can influence not only our own perceptions and behaviors, but the responses we elicit from others and the outcomes we generate. Wilson illustrates this principle with striking examples. When individuals believe they are unlovable, they tend to act withdrawn, defensive, or desperate, which provokes rejection from others, confirming the original belief. When they believe they are attractive and worthy of love, they tend to behave confidently, warmly, and openly, which elicits acceptance, again confirming the belief. The same applies at larger scales. When groups believe they are persecuted, they tend to generate self-fulfilling prophecies, creating conflict and suspicion that provokes hostility from others. When groups believe they can cooperate and coexist, they tend to create environments that foster trust and collaboration. This is why Wilson argues that the most important power any individual possesses is the ability to direct their own thinker consciously. The question is not whether we will believe something, we must, but what we will choose to believe and how flexible we will remain in revising those beliefs when they no longer serve us. Wilson is careful to acknowledge that this is not a prescription for naivety, delusion, or blind positivity. It is not about denying reality, but about recognizing that our perceptions and interpretations are always shaped by prior beliefs, and that these beliefs are malleable, not fixed. In this sense, Chapter 15 provides a kind of psychological key to the entire Prometheus Rising project: understanding and mastering the thinker. Prover dynamic allows us to move beyond passive victimhood and become active creators of our experience. This is especially crucial in a world saturated with competing reality tunnels, media narratives, ideological battles, cultural programming, and inherited prejudices all vie for control of our thinker, seeking to implant beliefs that our prover will then work tirelessly to confirm. Wilson's antidote is conscious self-observation and experimentation. He encourages us to treat beliefs as tools rather than truths, to adopt useful narratives provisionally, test them in experience, and discard or modify them as needed. The exercises he proposes for this chapter reflect this pragmatic approach. One exercise involves deliberately adopting a new belief, one that seems counterintuitive, foreign, or challenging, and observing how quickly one's nervous system begins finding evidence to support it. For example, an individual who habitually believes they are unlucky could experiment with the belief, "I am a very lucky person." Over time, the prover will begin to filter perception in ways that reveal unexpected opportunities, happy coincidences, and positive outcomes. Another exercise involves questioning one's most cherished beliefs. Where did this belief come from? Who imprinted or conditioned me to believe this? How does this belief influence my perception of the world? Does it serve my goals, growth, and well-being, or does it limit me? A more advanced exercise involves cultivating cognitive flexibility, the capacity to shift between belief systems fluidly without rigid attachment as the situation demands. This is the hallmark of metaprogramming consciousness, the ability to use beliefs as tools, adapting them to circumstances, and revising them in light of experience. By the end of Chapter 15, Wilson makes it clear that the thinker-prover dynamic is the engine of human subjectivity, the mechanism by which reality tunnels are constructed, maintained, and reinforced. Recognizing this mechanism is the first step toward liberating oneself from unconscious programming. Mastering this mechanism is the path to conscious evolution, the ability to choose, design, and inhabit reality tunnels that foster growth, creativity, flexibility, compassion, and joy. In this sense, Chapter 15 serves as both a summary and a pivot point in Prometheus Rising. It synthesizes many of the key insights from earlier chapters: feedback loops, reality tunnels, perception as construction, and points forward to the possibility of deliberate self-creation. Wilson's message is ultimately empowering. You are not a passive victim of circumstance, conditioning, or fate. You are an active participant in the creation of your own experience, equipped with the capacity to direct your thinker and thereby shape what your prover proves. The invitation is to stop living unconsciously within inherited narratives and to begin crafting new narratives consciously, creatively, and compassionately, not just for oneself, but for the world we co-create with every thought, word, action, and perception. In Chapter 16 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson pivots from describing circuits and cognitive dynamics to offering something more practical and empowering, a user's manual for the human brain itself. This chapter synthesizes much of what has come before and reframes the entire journey of the book as a call for intentional, experimental, and creative participation in one's own psychological evolution. Wilson begins with a striking premise: that most people are operating their nervous systems without any clear understanding of how it works or how to optimize it. We are all born into this extraordinary biocomputer, a vast, adaptive, evolving network of circuits, feedback loops, and potentialities, but most of us simply allow early conditioning, cultural programming, and social pressures to determine its settings for life. This is akin to being given a complex spaceship and using it like a horse and cart, unaware of its advanced capabilities, tools, and potential modes of operation. Wilson's metaphor of a user's manual points to a profound truth. Most education systems, religious institutions, and cultural traditions have historically discouraged independent exploration of the brain's capabilities. Instead, they tend to promote conformity, obedience, and mechanical repetition, keeping individuals locked into the first 4 circuits of survival, status, symbolic abstraction, and social conditioning. But Wilson insists that this limitation is not a feature of the brain itself. It is the result of inadequate programming. The human brain is a self-modifying, self-organizing evolutionary tool capable of much more than most people ever realize. The task, then, is to learn how to use it properly, to explore its capabilities consciously, to reprogram limiting beliefs, to cultivate flexibility and creativity, and ultimately, to awaken the higher circuits of neurosomatic ecstasy, metaprogramming awareness, evolutionary consciousness, and cosmic unity. Wilson argues that using the brain properly requires understanding the relationship between its circuits and the reality tunnels they generate. Each circuit offers a different lens through which to interpret experience, and each is activated, imprinted, and reinforced by different kinds of stimuli. In early life, imprinting tends to happen automatically, unconsciously, and irreversibly. The infant bonds to caregivers, accepts tribal rules, adopts linguistic and cultural maps, and internalizes social expectations. But at a certain stage, often through crisis, experimentation, or self-inquiry, individuals begin to glimpse the possibility of metaprogramming, of consciously observing and modifying the programs that shape perception, emotion, behavior, and belief. Wilson emphasizes that this capacity for self-programming is the key to unlocking the brain's latent potential. The individual who masters metaprogramming becomes a pilot rather than a passenger of their own nervous system. He offers several principles to guide this process. First, the brain is a feedback system. It responds to its own output, generating loops of behavior and perception that can either reinforce limitations or foster growth. To use the brain well, one must pay careful attention to feedback, both internal, thoughts, emotions, bodily sensations, and external, responses from the environment, and adjust accordingly. Second, the brain is programmable, but also plastic. Early imprints are not necessarily permanent, but they can be deeply ingrained. Changing them requires persistence, experimentation, and a willingness to disrupt habitual patterns. Third, the brain is multimodal. It is capable of operating from different circuits, perspectives, and levels of abstraction, depending on the situation and the individual's state of consciousness. Learning to switch between circuits fluidly is one of the hallmarks of mastery. Wilson points out that most conflicts and misunderstandings arise from individuals operating from different circuits without recognizing the differences. For example, a person locked into the second circuit of territorial emotions may react with aggression or defensiveness, while a person operating from the sixth circuit of metaprogramming awareness may respond with curiosity or humor. This principle extends to cultures as well. Societies dominated by first circuit fears will generate different values, institutions, and conflicts than societies that foster higher circuit consciousness. Wilson suggests that part of the task of conscious evolution is to cultivate circuit literacy, an understanding of which circuits are active in oneself and others at any given time, and the ability to navigate these dynamics skillfully. This is where the user's manual becomes practical. Wilson proposes a series of exercises and experiments designed to help readers explore, activate, and integrate the different circuits consciously. For the first circuit, biosurvival, he recommends cultivating relaxation, security, and bodily awareness, practices like deep breathing, meditation, yoga, or Tai Chi that help reduce chronic tension and restore a sense of grounded safety. For the second circuit, emotional territorial, he encourages examining emotional reactions, dominant struggles, and territorial behaviors, learning to observe and modify them rather than being driven unconsciously by them. For the third circuit, symbolic, he advocates developing linguistic precision, logical clarity, and semantic awareness, recognizing the limits of language and using it skillfully as a tool rather than a trap. For the fourth circuit, sociosexual, he suggests examining social conditioning, sexual attitudes, and group affiliations critically, exploring ways to reprogram limiting scripts and embrace more authentic, flexible modes of relating. For the fifth circuit, neurosomatic, he recommends cultivating sensory awareness, pleasure, and bodily flow, dancing, artistic expression, massage, and practices that reconnect mind and body in an integrated whole. For the sixth circuit, metaprogramming, he proposes journaling, thought experiments, perspective shifting, and cognitive flexibility exercises designed to help individuals recognize and revise their own belief systems consciously. For the seventh circuit, neurogenetic, he encourages practices that foster evolutionary awareness, meditation on ancestry, participation in ecological or humanitarian causes, and the cultivation of long-term vision. For the eighth circuit, neuroatomic, he suggests contemplative practices that dissolve ego boundaries, cultivate cosmic perspective, and invite transpersonal awareness, gazing at the stars, contemplating the vastness of space-time, or engaging in carefully guided psychedelic experiences where safe and legal. Throughout this chapter, Wilson underscores that the point is not to transcend or escape the lower circuits, but to integrate them into a flexible, adaptive, and creative whole. A well-used brain is not one that rejects the body, society, or language, but one that understands their place in a larger evolutionary process and learns to navigate them with intelligence, compassion, and skill. By the end of chapter 16, Wilson frames the task of using the brain properly as a lifelong adventure, a process of continuous learning, experimentation, self-observation, and adaptation. He emphasizes that this process is inherently joyful and liberating. As we become more conscious of our own programs and feedback loops, we gain freedom from mechanical reactions, rigid beliefs, and inherited limitations. We become more playful, more curious, more creative, and more capable of participating consciously in the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself. This is where Wilson's metaphor of Prometheus Rising comes full circle. Prometheus, the archetypal rebel who stole fire from the gods, represents not just technological or scientific knowledge, but the fire of self-knowledge, the ability to understand, modify, and direct our own nervous systems consciously. In this sense, Chapter 16 serves as a manifesto for neuropsychological autonomy. It invites each reader to become the architect of their own mind, the author of their own reality tunnel, and the pilot of their own evolutionary journey. By offering a user's manual for the brain, Wilson empowers us to reclaim responsibility for the very instrument through which we experience, interpret, and create reality itself. In Chapter 17 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson shifts from his exploratory journey through circuits and feedback loops to a candid, almost confrontational examination of one of the most pervasive forces shaping human experience: mind-washing. But Wilson's framing of mind-washing isn't about sinister conspiracies or dystopian control in the traditional sense, though he does acknowledge those dimensions. Instead, he presents mind-washing as an inevitable byproduct of how human nervous systems are structured: programmable, imprintable, and deeply sensitive to feedback and repetition. He begins with a bold claim: all human beings are mind-washed. The only difference is by whom and for what purpose. The term mind-washing carries heavy connotations of coercion, manipulation, and authoritarian regimes. But Wilson strips the term down to its essential meaning: the process of programming human nervous systems through repetition, reward, punishment, imitation, and suggestion. From this perspective, parenting is mind-washing, education is mind-washing, religion is mind-washing, advertising is mind-washing, media is mind-washing. Even culture itself is a vast mind-washing apparatus, a system for transmitting values, norms, categories, and belief systems from one generation to the next. This is not inherently sinister. It is simply how humans pass on knowledge, behavior patterns, and cultural codes. But Wilson's point is that most of this mind-washing is unconscious. Parents, teachers, religious leaders, and institutions often transmit programs they themselves inherited, without conscious reflection or critical evaluation. In this way, society reproduces itself mechanically, generation after generation, through feedback loops of imprinting and conditioning that feel natural, inevitable, and invisible to most participants. Wilson connects this to the principle introduced in Chapter 15. What the thinker thinks, the prover proves. Once early programs are installed, the nervous system filters all subsequent experience to confirm them, reinforcing the belief structures that define one's reality tunnel. This creates not only individual self-sealing loops, but also entire cultural and ideological echo chambers, where shared assumptions go unquestioned and dissenting perspectives are dismissed, ridiculed, or demonized. Wilson's analysis anticipates contemporary discussions of echo chambers, filter bubbles, and information silos, even though he was writing decades before the internet amplified these dynamics globally. The key takeaway of this chapter is not that mind-washing is rare or exceptional, but that it is universal and pervasive. Every human being's nervous system has been shaped by external forces seeking to install particular programs, narratives, and behaviors. This insight can feel destabilizing, even threatening, but for Wilson, it is liberating. By recognizing the mechanisms of mind-washing, we become capable of resisting, revising, and transcending them. Wilson draws on the work of Alfred Korzybski and general semantics to illustrate how linguistic structures themselves are tools of mind-washing. The grammar, syntax, and metaphors of any given language shape perception and behavior at deep levels, embedding assumptions about time, causality, identity, and relationship that feel natural, but are in fact culturally constructed. He points out that even concepts like truth, reality, good, and evil are embedded in semantic structures that reflect the assumptions of particular cultures and historical periods. To break free from mind-washing, we must learn to recognize these structures and treat them as provisional models, rather than absolute truths. Wilson also highlights the role of media in contemporary mind-washing. Advertising, public relations, political propaganda, and mass entertainment work together to shape attitudes, desires, fears, and expectations, often in ways that serve economic or political interests rather than individual freedom or well-being. This is where Wilson's analysis becomes especially urgent. Modern humans live in an unprecedented media environment saturated with carefully crafted messages designed to manipulate behavior, belief, and perception. But Wilson avoids moral panic or conspiracy theorizing. His tone remains playful, curious, and pragmatic. The point is not to condemn mind-washing, but to understand it, and, more importantly, to take responsibility for our own programming. Wilson offers several strategies for recognizing and resisting unwanted mind-washing. Critical self-observation, cultivating the habit of noticing where one's beliefs, attitudes, and emotional reactions come from. Are they authentic, self-chosen, and functional? Or are they inherited, conditioned, and limiting? Semantic awareness, practicing mindfulness of language, recognizing how words, categories, and metaphors shape perception and influence behavior. This involves questioning fixed labels, rigid definitions, and habitual judgments. Media literacy, becoming an active, skeptical consumer of information. This means asking, who created this message? What is their agenda? What emotions or beliefs is this designed to elicit? What assumptions does it embed? Perspective shifting, deliberately exploring alternative viewpoints, worldviews, and reality tunnels. This could involve reading widely, engaging with different cultures, or experimenting with unfamiliar philosophies and belief systems. Metaprogramming practice, applying the sixth circuit skill of self-reprogramming to revise outdated, inherited, or dysfunctional mental scripts. Wilson stresses that these strategies are not about withdrawing from society, rejecting culture, or escaping influence altogether. That's impossible. The point is to develop flexibility, awareness, and creative agency within the context of a world where mind-washing is inevitable. He acknowledges that some degree of programming is necessary for social life. Language itself is a shared program. Cultural norms and rituals provide coherence and continuity. The question is not whether we will be programmed, but how consciously and creatively we will engage with programming, and how skillfully we will edit, revise, and innovate within the structures we inherit. This chapter resonates deeply with Wilson's larger Promethean theme, stealing fire from the gods. Just as Prometheus defied the Olympian order to bring fire to humanity, so too can individuals defy inherited programs and claim the fire of conscious self-direction. Wilson's humor and playfulness shine through here. He reminds us that the task of deprogramming and reprogramming ourselves is not grim, ascetic, or joyless. On the contrary, it can be playful, experimental, and exhilarating, a lifelong art of psychological self-creation. Throughout this chapter, Wilson also draws attention to how political and religious ideologies often depend on mind-washing to maintain their hold on populations. Totalitarian regimes, religious cults, and authoritarian movements all excel at isolating individuals from alternative viewpoints, saturating their environments with reinforcing messages, and suppressing dissent. But Wilson insists that mind-washing is not confined to overtly authoritarian systems. Even liberal democracies, capitalist economies, and secular cultures engage in mind-washing through advertising, entertainment, education, and media narratives that promote particular values, lifestyles, and expectations. The challenge, then, is universal. All individuals must confront the fact that their nervous systems have been shaped by external forces seeking to program them, and that freedom lies not in rejecting programming altogether, but in becoming conscious of it and taking an active role in shaping it. By the end of Chapter 17, Wilson returns to a theme that runs throughout Prometheus Rising: the recognition that we are programmable creatures, but that we can learn to program ourselves consciously, creatively, and compassionately. Mind-washing is not an aberration, it is the condition of human life. But awareness of mind-washing transforms it from a trap into an opportunity, the opportunity to reprogram oneself, to design reality tunnels that foster growth, freedom, joy, and connection, rather than fear, rigidity, and conformity. In this way, Chapter 17 serves as both a warning and an invitation. A warning about the unconscious forces that shape our beliefs and perceptions, and an invitation to become metaprogrammers of our own minds and architects of our own experience. Wilson's message is clear. You have already been programmed by parents, schools, media, culture, and history. The question is no longer, am I mind-washed, but by whom, for what purpose, and what will I do about it now? In answering this question creatively, courageously, and playfully, we fulfill the promise of Prometheus Rising. We become conscious participants in our own evolution, and in the collective evolution of human consciousness itself. Chapter 18 of Prometheus. Rising is more than a mere conclusion. It's a culmination of everything Robert Anton Wilson has built throughout the book. It's here that the metaphor of Prometheus, the rebel titan who stole fire from the gods, fully fuses with the reader's journey through circuits, feedback loops, reality tunnels, and self-programming. Wilson opens by reminding us that the fire Prometheus brought was not just warmth or light, but symbolic of knowledge, creativity, and the power to shape reality itself. In myth, this act was both an offense and a gift, an act of rebellion against divine authority and an act of generosity toward humanity. This paradox sits at the heart of Wilson's philosophy. Conscious self-liberation is both dangerous and empowering. By the time we reach this final chapter, we have been guided through every circuit of the human nervous system, taught the feedback loops that shape perception, and challenged to examine the ways in which belief and experience reinforce one another. We've explored evolutionary history, quantum physics, neurolinguistics, psychology, and mysticism. Wilson's aim has not simply been to educate, but to initiate, to lead readers into a new relationship with their own consciousness, one in which we stop living passively inside inherited programs and begin to shape our experience actively, creatively, and joyfully. In this chapter, Wilson makes a powerful point. The entire evolutionary history of humanity has been about expanding control over the environment through increased consciousness. From stone tools to agriculture, from language to writing, from science to space travel, each step reflects a Promethean impulse to awaken, to understand, and to apply knowledge in ways that liberate us from ignorance and limitation. But Wilson insists that the next stage in this evolutionary adventure is not external, but internal. The future of humanity depends not merely on further technological innovation, but on the evolution of consciousness itself. This is why he frames the model of the 8 circuits as an evolutionary roadmap. The first 4 circuits describe the pre-human and early human stages of evolution. Circuits 5 through 8 describe the evolutionary potentials still largely latent in modern humans. Prometheus Rising, then, is a metaphor for awakening these higher circuits, for stepping into conscious participation in our own neurological, psychological, and spiritual evolution. Wilson emphasizes that this is not about abandoning the lower circuits, but integrating them skillfully. A fully awakened human being does not repress bodily needs, emotional drives, symbolic reasoning, or cultural participation. They navigate all of these realms with awareness, flexibility, and creative play. This synthesis is the true fire of Prometheus, the ability to live in multiple circuits simultaneously, to move fluidly between states of consciousness as circumstances require, and to cultivate a broad, inclusive, multidimensional awareness that honors all aspects of human nature. Wilson also underscores the ethical dimension of this project. Conscious evolution carries with it a responsibility to others, to the species, and to the planet. The individual who awakens the higher circuits cannot remain indifferent to the suffering, ignorance, and conflict that arise from unconscious programming. Instead, Wilson encourages us to become neuropoliticians, architects not only of our own consciousness, but of social environments that foster creativity, compassion, freedom, and growth. This means designing feedback systems in education, media, politics, and culture that reward flexibility, experimentation, and curiosity rather than obedience, conformity, and rigidity. He points to historical figures who exemplify this Promethean spirit: Socrates, Giordano Bruno, Galileo, James Joyce, Buckminster Fuller, individuals who defied inherited programs, questioned dominant narratives, and expanded the horizons of human thought, often at great personal cost. But Wilson's point is that this spirit is not confined to rare geniuses or historical heroes. Every human being carries the potential for Promethean awakening. Every nervous system is capable of reprogramming itself, transcending conditioned limits, and participating consciously in the evolutionary adventure of life. In this sense, Chapter 18 is a call to action, an invitation to readers to take responsibility for their own consciousness, to stop living as passive recipients of cultural mind-washing, and become active, creative participants in the construction of their own experience and, by extension, the collective evolution of the species. Wilson also makes a crucial point about humor and play. Throughout Prometheus Rising, his tone has been irreverent, playful, and full of paradox, and this is deliberate. The Promethean project is not grim, authoritarian, or dogmatic. It is playful, experimental, joyful. The fully awakened mind does not cling to rigid beliefs or identities, but moves fluidly, laughing at itself and its own constructs, willing to revise, reframe, and reinvent as circumstances demand. This spirit of humor and play is essential because the task is immense: to undo the programming of millennia, to transcend tribalism, nationalism, sexism, racism, authoritarianism, all the legacy systems that keep humanity trapped in lower circuit conflicts and illusions. Wilson is realistic about the difficulty of this task. He acknowledges that most people will resist it, preferring the familiar comfort of inherited programs, even when those programs produce suffering, conflict, and stagnation. But he insists that even a small number of individuals awakening to their own neurolinguistic freedom can have disproportionate effects. Like a critical mass in physics, a small number of conscious individuals can trigger large-scale shifts in cultural evolution, feedback systems, and social institutions. This is why Wilson's work remains profoundly hopeful, even as he confronts the inertia of human conditioning. Every individual who wakes up, who begins to use their brain as a self-programming instrument of exploration and creativity, becomes a beacon, an agent of cultural evolution, a carrier of the Promethean flame. Toward the end of the chapter, Wilson suggests that the journey of Prometheus Rising is ultimately about recontextualizing the self, from a conditioned ego trapped in rigid belief systems to a playful, flexible, creative participant in an ongoing evolutionary adventure. The awakened mind does not see itself as fixed, finished, or separate, but as a process, a dynamic interplay of circuits, programs, feedback loops, and perceptions, all embedded in larger networks of social, cultural, biological, ecological, and cosmic processes. This profound recontextualization is the liberation that Wilson offers, not an escape from reality, but a deepened engagement with it, free from the illusions of fixity, certainty, and rigidity. In his final gesture, Wilson returns to the Promethean archetype itself. Prometheus was punished by Zeus for giving humanity fire, condemned to be chained to a rock while his liver was devoured daily by an eagle. Wilson invites us to reflect on this punishment metaphorically. The price of awakening, of stealing fire from the gods, is perpetual vulnerability, the willingness to endure uncertainty, ambiguity, misunderstanding, and even hostility from those who remain locked in inherited programs. But this is not a tragedy. The punishment of Prometheus is also his glory. By enduring the pain of awakening, he enables the evolution of the species, the flowering of creativity, and the expansion of consciousness itself. In this way, Wilson casts the reader as a modern Prometheus, an individual who, having glimpsed the mechanisms of mind, perception, belief, and feedback, now faces a choice: to remain chained to old programs or to rise, take the fire, and become a conscious participant in the creation of their own reality and the future of humanity. This final chapter leaves us with a profound sense of possibility. The nervous system is not a fixed machine, but a self-programmable instrument of consciousness, capable of infinite adaptation, creativity, and evolution. The fire of Prometheus is ours to claim, but only if we are willing to embrace the responsibility, vulnerability, and creative playfulness that come with awakening. By the final page, Wilson has completed his project. Prometheus Rising is not just a book, but an initiation, an invitation, and a toolkit for the conscious evolution of human beings in a world that desperately needs flexible, creative, awake minds. And so, here we are, at the edge of the map where Robert Anton Wilson left us, not with conclusions, but with tools, not with doctrines, but with the freedom to explore. From the biosurvival circuits to cosmic consciousness, from feedback loops to mind-washing, from rigid belief systems to playful experimentation. This has been a journey into what it means to be human, and what it means to rise beyond even that. The fire Prometheus stole is now in your hands. How you use it, how you program your mind, shape your perceptions, and build your own reality tunnels is up to you. But remember, the most powerful minds are not rigid. They are fluid, adaptive, curious. They embrace uncertainty as part of the game and creativity as their compass. Prometheus is still rising. The only question is, are you willing to rise too?